All right. Well, we are starting Hebrews chapter 8, and I title it The High Priest of the New Covenant. So let's see what we have in store for us with my new clicker. Aha. Well, the first question is, to get us thinking, if Jesus would have been accepted by the Jewish religious system and received as their Messiah, what kind of reforms could Jesus have made? I know many years ago I heard somebody make a comment, and I thought it was a very interesting comment. They said, one thing that would have really been the biggest blessing for the Catholic Church is if they would have made Martin Luther the Pope. You know, he would have done all the reforms, and that would have just changed everything, and, you know, there wouldn't have been all the, you know, Protestant Reformation, right?
Could he have changed the rules?
As if he would have been the Pope?
No, Jesus.
Good question. Could he have changed the rules?
I mean, they had so many laws they had to do.
Mm-hmm.
Could he say, we don't have to do these laws, let's do different laws?
I think it's a good question. You sound like you want to look like you want to say something, Paul.
Who, me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Couldn't get past it. I think there'd be a lot more peace in the Middle East. I think things would be not as headstrong.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that would be a good hope. But kind of going back to what Neen said, could he have changed the laws?
I think that would have been very difficult.
Well, you know, if you go back to the question, if they would have accepted, you know, him as their Messiah,
What about the people who were in charge, like the what are they called? Yeah, the Sadducees, those people. Could he have told them, let's get together, let's make laws that come from the heart,
mm-hmm.
love each other with,
Well, they,
I think the point is,
but they didn't make laws.
they didn't accept him as their Messiah.
Right.
right.
They just
They were self-serving. I mean, it was all about
Well,
them.
that's what
Yeah.
could have happened, they need to change that.
if they had accepted him, yes, he would have changed that.
They wouldn't be worried about keeping the laws,
That's right.
the stupid laws.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I won't give you the answer, but okay. Yeah, you have to wait, right? So, yeah. Okay. What was the tabernacle? If you remember, before the COVID struck, we were doing a big series on the tabernacle, and then right at the very end, we just had to stop it because we had to stop the services. So I see a hand up. Yes.
The high place of worship is given by God to Moses. He gave him the dimensions of how to build it and what dimensions to do it in. And it was a traveling church.
Traveling temple.
Right.
Traveling temple.
Yeah, it actually, they would take it to war.
Precursor of the temple.
Okay. Precursor of the temple.
It was Christ's home. I mean, God's home.
Was it a place where they gave sacrifices for their sins?
It was. Yeah. Okay. That's fun. What was another name for the tabernacle? No. Okay, let me go ahead and tell you. Just okay, remember a tabernacle is a tent, but a tent is not necessarily a tabernacle. The only building that was given, or the only tent that was given the term tabernacle, was the dwelling house of God. Okay? And so everybody was living in tents in the wilderness, but only God technically was in the tabernacle. Okay? And so the priests represented the people, right? And then the priest would go in to make unction for the people before God. He was the mediator, right? And so technically between God and the priest and so forth, it was also known as the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting, because that's where they met, right? Okay. Do the words consecrate and sanctify mean the same thing?
Doesn't consecrate means set aside, and sanctify is to clean up.
Clean. Stay clean.
Well, consecrate means anoint, I guess.
Okay. Actually, depending on their usage, they do mean the same thing. But when you use the term consecrate in relationship to the priest, it literally means to take something by hand. To take something by hand. Because what would the priest do? He would take the offering and then he would give that offering to God. Okay? So in some sentences it means the same thing, the two words. In other sentences, if it's related to the priest, it's referring to his duty of taking something and then giving it to God. Okay? That was a little bit of a tricky one. Do the words covenant and testament mean the same thing? Well,
It's more of a
We
promise.
have the New Testament that makes a new covenant.
Yeah, Old Testament.
That there was an old covenant too.
Promise.
So maybe yes.
Or no.
I don't know.
yeah.
Testament's more of like written down, like law, isn't it?
So a covenant's not written down?
It doesn't need to be, no, it's a promise.
Isn't covenant an agreement,
The covenant is an agreement.
and testament is what you believe.
Yeah, for the most part, again, you got to go to how it's used, but for the most part, they mean the same thing. The two words can be interchangeable. So, you guys aren't doing very good today, are you? Yeah, all right. All right, well, Jesus wore the same priestly garments in heaven as those worn by the priests long ago. Yeah. Well, some of you may know, some of you may not know. Some of you may ponder it because it's an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah.
He made a specific design of the garments. I mean, it was, he told Moses exactly what it should look like.
Exactly.
So,
He was to follow the pattern explicitly.
on heaven, so I bet you he is. Because again, he had to follow the pattern of what was in heaven.
That's what I would think, okay? But now then that brings me to the question. Yeah, he's coming. We got bumped. That kind of asks the question, okay, when Jesus is not serving as the high priest, let's say, and he's sitting on the throne, he wouldn't be wearing the priestly headdress. He would be wearing his crown, which is a diadem. And he would be dressed like a king. So, but I guess he has a changing room, I suppose. You could just change clothes and go from one to the other, right?
Only wear the garments inside of the tabernacle.
Okay.
You can't go outdoors with it, you have to change. The priest had to change his clothes.
That makes sense. Paul, you are speaking in sign language.
No, I'm not. I'm hearing voices and I can't figure out where they're coming from.
Okay. Okay. Well, the truth is there's a lot we know and there's a lot we don't know. Okay, but it's good stuff to think about, because if you don't think about it, if you care, you'll think about it, right? I would think. Okay. So, Christ's ministry in the heavenly tabernacle. And I'm going in the wrong direction. Okay. Hebrews chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. The point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. And who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by man. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, "See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain." So let's talk about that for just a moment. Jesus Christ is the high priest, and he is serving in the true sanctuary, which superseded the Levitical priesthood. Therefore, he is the mediator of a better covenant, thus rendering the old covenant obsolete. The high priests entered the Holy of Holies once a year and only stood in a small place before the symbol of God's throne. Okay, so there was a time that God was present in the tabernacle. We know there was also a time later that God left, his glory left, right? So, yeah. But Jesus fulfilled his earthly obligation and now sits on a throne at the right hand of the divine majesty in heaven itself. And this he will do forever. Therefore, his priesthood is infinitely above all others. Okay, so now we see, at least in a positionally speaking, the earthly priest had to stand, right? He'd enter the Holy of Holies, and he would stand. I don't know if he would kneel to pray, but he would stand there and he would sprinkle, right? Take the hyssop and dip it into the blood, and he would sprinkle some of that blood on the Ark of the Covenant. Maybe even around the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark is sometimes referred to as God's footstool, and sometimes it's referred to as God's throne. And inside, what's inside the Ark of the Covenant? The Ten Commandments.
A jar of manna.
Yeah, the jar of manna and the staff of Aaron. Aha! Okay. Yeah. And so the theory is that when God sees his law, he's seeing the people through the blood. And so therefore, their sins are covered for now, till the next year, right? Okay. Now, Jesus Christ fulfills his priestly duties in the holy place and the Holy of Holies, which is what we call the sanctuary, of the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by man. I think I'm pushing the wrong button. This true tabernacle in the Greek is confusing because it is an archetypal or antitypical, but that should not imply that the earthly tabernacle was bad or unreal. Let me explain that. You remember Joshua in the Old Testament? Because of his name and because of a lot of what he did, sometimes he's referred to as a typology of Jesus. Okay? There were other people that served as typologies. In other words, a small foreshadowing of what was to come. Okay? In some ways, Moses was a typology of Jesus. Okay? But now we have an interesting situation, because the tabernacle on earth is not a typology of the future, because the tabernacle in heaven preceded the one on earth. Does that make sense? So it's confusing, right? So instead of being a foreshadowing of things to come, which it was in a way, it still preceded the earthly tabernacle. So that's where we get into these terms right here, archetypal or antitypical, but that in no way implies that the earthly tabernacle was bad or that it was not real. Okay? In one sense, Christ's glorified body is the tabernacle, in one sense. Okay? In fact, that's one of the questions I was going to write down was, is the tabernacle a person, a place, or a thing? It seems to me to be a person, but it's also a place. It's kind of hard to explain, really. That's why eye has not seen nor ear has heard the things that are waiting in store for us in heaven, which right now would be completely incomprehensible because we can't comprehend it, right? So in one sense, Christ's glorified body is the tabernacle, and as he passes through the heavenly holy of holies and into the presence of God, he intercedes for us. So he's our intercessor, right? Every time Satan is going to and fro making accusations against us, what does Jesus do? He intercedes for us, right? Isn't that nice? Aren't we glad that we have an advocate, a mediator, an advocate, someone to stand in for us? So, well, let me ask you, where is the tabernacle in heaven? You ever wonder about that? Well, yeah, where? One day you might want to go visit. The highest point. Yeah, I think the highest point is God's throne. Because remember, Satan said,
If it's infinite, there is no highest point.
well, that's true.
So it's infinitely high. It's infinite.
But then again, God is also infinitely high.
But there is no such thing as infinity. You can't add or take away from infinity.
Or can you? No, I don't know. Well, just to put things into perspective a little bit, because, remember this, the Bible talks more about hell than it does heaven. And it talks more about money than it does heaven and hell combined. And I think the reason for that is because very often where your wallet is, there is where your heart is. And so, God's trying to get you to, to think and act like Jesus and not to act like yourself. But just to kind of put things into perspective, You have heaven, and heaven is the dwelling place of God. That's where we're promised a place, right, for us to live one day. And then we have what we call the New Jerusalem. Now, the New Jerusalem is, as far as we understand it, it is the capital city of heaven, okay? And the New Jerusalem seems to be portable as well, because we do know that the New Jerusalem one day will come down. It doesn't say it's going to touch terra firma, but it says it's going to come down, so I think it's going to be, I can't even imagine what that's going to look like, right? It seems like it's going to dwell in all three realms of spatial reality, the sky, space, and heaven, right? And of course, if you go by the dimensions in the scriptures, it makes a perfect cube. Makes a perfect cube. However, it does not specify if the sides are sloped or straight. So if they're sloped, it actually makes a pyramid, which is kind of fascinating too, okay? Now, I would assume that the tabernacle would be in the capital city, just as the sanctuary was in Jerusalem on earth. Could have been anywhere in Israel, but no, they put it in the capital city. Makes sense that they would put this tabernacle also in the capital city. And this is also called what? New Jerusalem, right? And so I believe that's where the tabernacle is. So that way when you get there, you won't have to constantly ask directions. You can kind of at least kind of know where you're going, right? And the cube is bigger in square mileage than the United States. So then when you calculate in the cubic miles, it's an astronomical.
Is that supposed to be 1,500 miles each side?
Yeah, something like that. Cubits or miles, but anyway, either way, it's
All the squares are 1,500 miles.
yeah. But it's a lot of space. It really is. And what did God say? He said, "In my Father's house there are many, many rooms." Right? And one thing I'm trying not to do is I don't know if the tabernacle in heaven is the same place as the throne room. I'm not 100% sure, because we know it's a tent of meeting. We know there's going to be beings there, right? There's going to be angels are going to be there. We know that people are going to be there, right? So this heavenly tabernacle is that holy place where the triune Godhead meets. And since Jesus is our high priest, we are also members of his body. This is where God's visible presence in Christ is manifested to his perfected saints and angels. So this is also the tent of meeting, okay? So is the tent of meeting and the throne room of God the same place? I don't really know. Therefore, in verse 3, Jesus was appointed to this position. It was the assignment of every high priest to enter in and offer both sacrifices and gifts, and Jesus could do no less. Yet only Jesus was qualified to serve in the heavenly temple, and he entered the holy place with his own blood. So that's kind of an interesting thought, that he'd enter the place with his own blood. You know? I mean, I never pictured Jesus per se carrying his own blood. But that seems to be what is being said in the text, okay? Yeah. But that one sacrifice in blood, the text seems to imply that he brought blood with him, okay? Now, maybe that's not the case. I don't know. The blood used for sprinkling in heaven is Christ's own blood, and believers will be sprinkled. This is what the commentators say, right? Believers will be sprinkled as they enter, signifying that their election is complete. And consider 1 Peter 1 and verse 2. It says, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, for obedience to Christ Jesus and sprinkling by his blood. So there's almost an impression there that there has to be a sprinkling as part of the finalizing of the process. Jesus was sanctified or set apart for his position as high priest, but he was also consecrated for that position. In this context, a consecrated priest literally means, again, to fill the hand. So just as the hand is filled with the gift or the sacrifice, it is the job of the priest now to bestow that gift, in this case to God the Father. This implies that an offering is given into the hands of the priest, well, I just said that, which then is the duty to present the offering to God. In verse 4, notice the words, men who offer the gifts. The verb offer is in the present tense, as it is in other places in this letter. This indicates that the temple in Jerusalem was still in operation when this letter was written. So there we have our pre-AD 70 date. Okay? So the temple was still in operation, and these Jewish believers would have known that as well. Oh, burning somebody's eyes out. Christ's priestly office is exercised in heaven, not on earth, in the power of his resurrected life, not in his earthly life. The point is that no mere mortal man could have performed the priestly duties in the heavenly temple. Likewise, Jesus could not have fulfilled the priestly function in the earthly temple. Okay, because he was not a Levite. And the law said that he had to be of the lineage of Levi, right? But he was technically the lineage of Judah. And so legally he could not have served in that capacity as the high priest or any type of priest. The animal was slain or bled out, and that term is what we call sacerdotal. It means the sacrifice. Then it was processed. Some of it was disposed of, some of it was set aside, some of it was burned. The select cuts were burned as the offering to God upon the altar. However, the actual sanctification was achieved by the presentation of the blood. And in this case, this is a blood sacrifice. So it's known as an oblation. Okay, it's a blood oblation within the sanctuary by the high priest. So if they cut the lamb's throat and bleed him out, he dies. But then the sanctification hasn't really, it started, but it isn't complete. Then they process it, they burn they burn the offering, but it's still not complete. It's not complete until the priest actually goes in and submits the blood. I thought that was kind of interesting. So here we see what we would call the lower priests performing the duty. Here we have, on the Day of Atonement once a year, the high priest, as he's entering going from the holy place to the Holy of Holies. Jesus could not be a priest under the Mosaic law or the Jewish religious system while on earth, but the earthly priesthood did ultimately end, as we know. Really not too much after that point in time. The verse in verse 5, Moses had the task of building the tabernacle, and God personally warned or charged or commanded him to follow the precise pattern that he had established. I think that's very interesting. Whether it was with the garments, whether it was with the building, whether it was with the priestly duties, everything was spelled out for them. Therefore, this pattern is the copy, sketch, or shadow of the heavenly tabernacle. The Greek word for pattern can also be translated to example. The heavenly tabernacle, again, is that antitypical reality and primary archetype, and the reference to the mountain symbolizes heaven. So if you read that text, it mentions that God warns him to obey the pattern, just like I showed you on the mountain, okay? And in this case, the mountain represents heaven. Through vision and or verbally, God communicated to Moses an accurate representation of the real heavenly sanctuary. Therefore, the earthly tabernacle was a copy. So the one that we had here was a copy. And one thing, I think I'm going to mention this, but just in case I don't, even with the finest craftsmen, creating everything in detail to God's specifications, the earthly tabernacle did not compare. It cannot compare to what God has in heaven. Because man built the one on earth, but who built the one in heaven? Yeah, God did it. He built it. So, can you imagine? This is just a little, it's a shadow of what's really in heaven, right? Yeah. And if you remember every little layer on that tabernacle, if you remember when we were studying this a while back, everything has a different fabric, everything has a different color, everything has a different symbology, right? Every anchor, every connection. Some connections were made out of brass. Some connections were made out of silver. Some things inside the tabernacle were made out of gold, right? Everything had a symbolism behind it. And here we see the high priest on the Day of Atonement. He has a little bit of incense with him, so I'm sure he's praying mightily under his breath at least, right? Because he's scared to death. I would be. And there you see the chalice, and maybe somewhere he's got his hyssop to do the sprinkling. The earthly tabernacle or temple is, in all of its grandeur, couldn't compare to the majestic glory of the original in heaven. Huh? Yeah. This is why it's a shadowy representation which gave a dim and imperfect idea of the pattern, but not the fine features. So much that we can't see in the earthly. So why do it? Why do it at all? This shadow was to lead their minds to something or someone nobler than themselves. Yet without enough light, there is little color. I'm just kind of speaking metaphorically now, because remember, it's a shadow of the real one, right? And where there's little light, there's no color. Shapes are distorted and bad depth perception, right? But they could still see, you'd think they could see, that it represented Christ. You'd think. Both the tabernacle and the ministry of the priesthood were intended to symbolize the only way a sinner could approach a holy God and find forgiveness, spiritual evangelical worship. By the way, why did I word it that way? One commentator worded it that way, and I got to thinking about it, and I thought, yeah, I like that. What is spiritual evangelical worship?
Go ahead and tell us, Chris. Don't lead us hanging. Come on.
Nobody's gonna say what they think.
Yeah, usually people talk. Okay. Well, first of all, if the Spirit's not living in you, you're not worshiping. I mean, that's common sense. I mean, everybody should have got that one right off the bat. I mean, Scripture even tells us to worship in what? Spirit and in truth. If the Spirit's not in you, you can't genuinely worship God, okay? What about the term evangelical? And I've told you guys this before. What does the word evangelical traditionally mean? No, that's evangelism. The word evangelical traditionally means a Bible believer. Okay? Now later, because of politics, people now equate this group with the rights, and they are the evangelical, and it has different meanings now, but traditionally, an evangelical was a Bible believer. Okay? So this was the only way that we could find forgiveness. We could find spiritual evangelical worship and everlasting glory. Everlasting glory. The only way, right? Okay. How many of you were in the Sunday school class? My son, I filled in for Mark Holmes. Any of you were in the Sunday school class Sunday morning? No. Okay. Well, anyway, I did this little chart, and this is a chart that I use sometimes when I'm sharing Christ with somebody. I have a tendency like to just do it on a piece of paper. Somebody wants to know more about Jesus. I'll say, "Oh, well, do you have a piece of paper?" "Oh yeah." Okay. And I'll do like a little doodle form, okay? But I start off on the top usually. Usually I make like a little triangle, and in the middle of the triangle I write the word God. And because everything starts with God, right? And of course, God's the creator, right? He made man. But man did something bad. What was that? He sinned, right? And sin is what has been the barrier to God and man forever. I mean, that's one thing, because God is what? He's holy. He can't allow sin into his heaven, right? He hates sin, right? So we have to understand that because God is holy, that means he's also perfect in every way. And perfect love demands the forgiveness of sin. But also because God is holy, his justice is perfect. And perfect justice demands the punishment for sin. So God's got a problem. How do I forgive sin and how do I punish sin at the same time? You remember this? Well, he solves that problem through Jesus. You guys are acting like you heard this for the first time, right? He solves the problem through Jesus, okay? And what did Jesus do? He paid for our sins, and he purchased for us a place in heaven that he offers as a free gift. And the way we receive that gift, I'm about to break this thing. The way we receive that gift is through faith. Remember the 5-finger review? Okay, let me back that up now one. Okay. So anyway, I did this. I just happened to do this on Sunday totally randomly, right? But then as I was preparing for tonight, this is what I found. This is an outline of the tabernacle, right? And here we have the animal that is killed for our sin, right? You know, it's slain upon the altar. Because, of course, again, man is a sinner, right? God's up here holy, the Ark of the Covenant. He's holy. God can't allow sin into heaven, right? And so we have to remember that because God is holy, that means His love, you know, it's completely perfect, and perfect love demands the forgiveness of sin. I just told you the wrong thing. His justice is perfect, and therefore justice demands the punishment for sin. Why is this punishment? Because it's light. That's the candlestick. What does it do? It's the truth. It illuminates the sin, right? Okay, I told you the wrong thing. Okay, so God's justice is perfect, which demands the punishment for sin, but God's love, look at the table of showbread, that's grace. His love is perfect, which demands the forgiveness of sin. So how does God solve that problem, right? Well, He solves that problem through Jesus, right? And, you know, here we have what? We have here the laver, right? We're cleansed from our sin, and I can't really read some of that stuff. But anyway, because of Jesus, the temple veil was what? Torn. And now we have access to God the Father through Christ the Son. Isn't that an amazing parallel? I mean, that's just fantastic. And I just thought, wow. Okay. Now let's stop here.